So we are continuing this series we've been doing a couple of weeks left, I think, after this on meals with Jesus. And as we've seen, and as we'll continue to see, there are a lot of meal times with Jesus in the gospel accounts of his life. Food and Jesus seem to go together pretty often, particularly, it seems, in Luke's gospel, who tells us various stories of Jesus sharing food with a whole range of people. And so here's another meal-based story from Luke's gospel for us to get our teeth into for today. From Luke chapter 14. See what you make of this.
One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So, taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And they had nothing to say. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this person your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted.
Now, not only are there lots of meals, as we're saying in Luke's gospel, there's also a common theme of Jesus challenging people's views at the time of what the Sabbath was all about, this God-given day, which the Pharisees, this particularly hardcore sect of Jews, they turned into a burden rather than a blessing. And so just as on other occasions, Jesus has been invited to a meal at a Pharisee's house on the Sabbath. An invitation, though, which feels like it has an ulterior motive, in that the Pharisees are often looking for ways to criticize Jesus for not doing things their way. Indeed, we're told this at the top of the reading. So they say, one Sabbath when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. Jesus is under scrutiny. Quite the opposite, we might think, of the warm and welcoming atmosphere that should characterize a shared meal, particularly a Sabbath meal, which should be about celebrating God's goodness. So straight away on this Sabbath occasion, something feels strange. What's more, we're then told that there in front of him, Jesus, was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Some translations say dropsy. Now, why is this man with this swelling here in this meal? Well, we don't know. He could have been an invited guest who was being treated as an equal, or maybe he just followed Jesus into this Pharisee's house. We don't know why he's there, but we do know from other religious writings from the time of Jesus, though, is that some Pharisees would have interpreted this man's condition as being a sign of judgment from God. They would have considered the fact that his body was all swollen to be a punishment from God for how he'd lived. And so maybe this poor guy has simply been brought in by these Pharisees as a way of testing Jesus. You know, how is he going to respond to this guy with a swollen body that these Pharisees think is being judged by God? Well, as is often the case, Jesus seems to know their motives and instead turns the tables on them by testing them. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. They had no answer. We might say, actually, they chickened out of answering Jesus, trapped, it seems, by their own rules of what was or wasn't permissible on the Sabbath. When, of course, with Jesus, we know that since love is the law, of course, the kind and compassionate thing would be to heal someone, regardless of what day it was. And so at this mealtime, on this Sabbath day, taking hold of the man, Jesus healed him there and then and sent him on his way. We're then told that Jesus makes an interesting observation, as when he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. And we'll come on to the parable in a bit. But it's worth knowing that in Jesus' day, there was usually a very definite seating plan in place for most social occasions, with places of honor being next to the host, with the seats becoming less honorable, the cheap seats, if you like, the further away you got from the one who was hosting the meal. No comment on that today, by the way. All right. And so knowing this honor system of where people are sat and where people have chosen to sit, he tells this parable. He says, when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, on the one hand, I think this parable, it kind of reads less perhaps as a parable and more as just as good social etiquette, the equivalent of better to sit at the back and be invited forward than sit at the front and be told to move, basic kind of good manners practice going on. But since it's a parable, there must be a deeper meaning going on with it as well. What could that be? Well, as always, context is key, because Jesus, remember, is telling this parable to these Pharisees who think they are spiritually superior to other people in the eyes of God. Superior, no doubt, to that poor guy with the abnormal swelling who we saw earlier. But Jesus effectively says, look, the moment you think of yourself as spiritually superior, well, prepare to be humbled, because that superior attitude reveals just how far you've got to go. Whereas actually those who consider themselves as spiritual novices are far more on track with God than they realize, and God will choose to exalt and champion and honor them. So the lesson to the Pharisees is pretty clear in this parable. But what are we to make of this? How do we apply this to our lives? Well, two things, I think. One as a warning and one as an encouragement. Let's go with the bad news first. Let's go with the warning first. Because I suspect there are times when it's all too easy for us to succumb to the temptation of thinking of ourselves in a spiritually superior way to others. Particularly if we've been a person of faith or coming to church for a good while. So I remember, for example, one conversation I had here a while back where someone said to me once about new people coming to St. John's. They said to me, it's great they're here, but I'm worried that they don't know the basics of what it means to be a Christian. So I said to this person, I'm curious, how would you define the basics of what it is to be a Christian? And for them, the basics were all about doctrine and theology, having the right set of beliefs. And yet when we look at the life of Jesus, he seems to me to be not so much interested in what people believe than in how they live. Are they kind and compassionate? Are they generous? Are they humble? Yes, of course, our beliefs can inform and shape our lives, but it seems ultimately it's the fruit of our faith in Jesus that matters and is his main focus. So that's certainly a warning to me, maybe to you, not to elevate belief over behavior, because often those with the most doubts end up doing the deepest of divine deeds of all. But then secondly, the flip side of this, the encouragement, if you like, from Jesus, is that when we do feel uncertain or unworthy, when we feel inadequate or insufficient, well then, says Jesus, that's the kind of humility that I long to honour. It's interesting that elsewhere, Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It seems to me that the kingdom of heaven belongs, therefore, to the hesitant, to the humble, those who habitually choose the lowest seats, because it's they, maybe it's you, who Jesus would say, come on, come and sit next to me. Come and sit at my table because you're going to be my guest of honour today. As he says at the end of this little passage, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So may we learn this truth, and may it guide and shape our lives with God and with one another, both today and always. Amen.